Well, thanks so much for joining us today. We have a tremendous group of global leaders in the global development sector joining us this morning here in Washington, D.C., which is where I'm based, although folks are based in different places. And I just want to start by thanking our panelists so much for being here with us. As we know, it's been a time of upheaval, and this feels like a very good time to be hearing from leaders who have been leading the way in their organizations, in their countries, in keeping the great work that is taking place in global development, and hearing how are they managing themselves, how are they supporting their teams, what is the experience that they're having in their leadership roles, and what it is that we can learn from them. So welcome everyone. And I think one of the things that's very exciting is that we do have people joining us who have different responsibilities, ranging from leading a global movement to people who are leading some of the largest US-based development companies and not-for-profits. So let's get started. Sarah Helmstetter, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to invite you to introduce yourself. And then would love to hear about the work that you're doing leading your company's response to COVID-19. But if you could start off by telling us a bit about yourself, Sarah.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Fiona, for having me on the panel. I'm really honored to be participating in the Wild Week. It's super fun. So I am Vice President of HR at DAI. DAI is one of the larger global development companies with offices around the world. So in this health crisis, I'm the point person. I received thousands of calls and emails from people at all levels of the company from all around the globe. So, when we were talking about this panel, Fiona, you had asked me about priorities and have my priorities changed and how has this crisis affected me as a leader? My priority over the last few months has not changed. It continues to be the health, safety, and well-being of DAI staff. While my priority may not have changed, my universe of responsibility has expanded greatly during the pandemic. And one of the biggest points I'd like to share with today's audience of leaders and aspiring leaders is on the expansion of responsibility during a crisis. And I'm not talking about the hundreds of additional tasks, the thousands of coordinating meetings, and all the memos that get thrown at you. I'm talking about the major expansion of responsibility in terms of decision making. As a senior leader, I have to make decisions. And what I've come to understand is that during crises, many people who make decisions on a regular basis during regular times no longer want to do so. Many are more comfortable when rules are very clear, even if that removes individual agency. In fact, I found that many, including very senior level staff, are looking to give up decision-making responsibility. So this became very clear to me early on in the year as we worked to provide guidance to staff on travel and coming into the office. The easiest route would have been for us to give a black and white directive and shut things down. Instead, did we do that? No. Instead, my task force worked really hard to enable staff to make their own decisions on travel within their comfort zone, within the confines of the latest guidance from public health, security, and travel authorities. After all, we figured who knew better than they about the essentialness of the trip, their own health, and family situations. We thought we were empowering staff to make decisions within the boundaries of government and DAI guidelines. But what we thought was empowerment, many looked at as our being indecisive and reactive rather than proactive. As the outbreak turned into a pandemic and we put a stop on travel and instituted a 100% remote work policy, I noticed that staff became more comfortable. And this reaction was not restricted to junior colleagues. It included senior level staff who I know in many other situations are very comfortable with being in control and making decisions. So when I mentioned this seemingly contradictory behavior to my husband, who happens to be a cognitive scientist, he wasn't in the least surprised. He spouted off about the neural and behavioral literatures, and I see Fiona smiling. Fiona knows him. Here's what I gleaned from the lecture. there's a large body of research on cognitive function under stress. Under stress, and a global pandemic is certainly worthy of causing a massive amount of stress. Under stress, working memory and executive functions are compromised. So to put this in layman's terms, we have all these worry wheels that are spinning around in our brains, sucking up mental energy that under ordinary circumstances we'd be putting to shifting gears rapidly from task to task and making decisions. So we see this impact of stress on world-class athletes who choke under the high pressure of competition, and we see the impact on highly competent senior leaders during a pandemic who may struggle to make decisions. And let me say that this is not a statement about overall competence, but rather about how stress impacts individual brains. So to come back to Fiona, to your original question to me, about priorities and the effect of the pandemic on me as a leader, the biggest change of leading during the crisis has not, hasn't lain in the expansion of duties, which has been very real, but is really in the heightening of decision making. And I find that I not only have to make my own decisions, but I also have to make decisions about the decisions of others. And I'll stop there.
Wow. Well, that's really profound, Sarah. And thank you for, bringing to life probably the reality that a lot of people are experiencing, both those who feel like they are making decisions at the level that they want to, as well as perhaps being surprised at some of their indecisiveness or difficulty making decisions, in this time, compared to different times. So I really appreciate you sharing all that. Simi, you're based in Lagos, Nigeria. I'd like to invite you to introduce yourself, and then if you could please paint the picture for us of the environment that you're operating in Lagos, and what leadership qualities are you drawing on?
Okay, hi. Hi, I'm Simi Nwogugu. I'm the Executive Director of Junior Achievement Nigeria, which empowers young people for work readiness skills. And I'm also a trustee for Project ARC. The leadership skills I'm experiencing in Nigeria is really around what will enable us survive in the season. We're finding that during the COVID-19 lockdown, there are a number of businesses that are suffering in the country, which has led to a decrease in their, they're having to lay off staff. So it's led to a decrease in the funds they have for corporate social responsibility. So organizations like ours, which depend on CSR funding, are having to really innovate on and it's also the time that they really need us the most, because the government needs innovative ideas for education. A lot of corporations need innovative ideas on how to show they care for their communities. And so they do need us, but at the same time, the funds are not available. So how do we come up with ways that we can innovate without needing a lot of funds? It's also quite possible that we may have to think about how we structure our staff in a way that as an organization, we're able to survive the pandemic. And so what I'm finding myself doing is working with my executive team to think about what are the solutions we can think about for managing our finances, so that, to the extent possible, we don't have to let anybody go. Do we have to think about taking leave without pay, since there's a reduction in the work because schools are closed at the moment? Is it, reduction in work hours and therefore a commensurate reduction in pay? But also realizing that people have different responsibilities that they will continue to meet, whether or not they have a full workload. And so trying to manage that balance between being an empathic leader and also wanting the organization to survive are the things that I'm battling with on a daily basis. And realizing also that we would need a lot more collaboration with other organizations to make sure that things work. So innovation, collaboration, and empathy are the three things that that I see that as we need more to survive through the pandemic.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. And it's interesting that you bring that up because those, in speaking with Rupa and Sylvia in preparation for this panel, the empathy, having high amounts of empathy was something that really, came out of your remarks, Sylvia and Rupa. You also talked about the importance of continuous and open communication. So Rupa, could I just invite you to elaborate on those comments? Like could you share a story about like where and from whom are you seeing these kind of leadership qualities come up? And then how are you thinking about maintaining these good practices, these strong leadership practices, and supporting other leaders to maintain them as well, even when we move out of this crisis period?
Right, thanks, Fiona. And again, my name is Rupa Dodd, and I serve as the Executive Director of Women in Global Health. We were founded in 2015 and really built on a model of movements. And so it's in our DNA already to be very collaborative and sort of use flat leadership styles to begin with. So in COVID times, it's actually just testing what are our values already. So using collaborative leadership, having a lot of communication, and then I think also just really building on this idea of empathy. And what we really have had to do is our movement has chapters all around the world, and their contexts and realities are very different. So right now, we had a work plan around the year of the nurse and midwife, but with COVID-19 hitting really hard in all different countries, one of the things we did have to do is really shift the plans and priorities with our chapters, and some of them were planning to launch with in-person events, and now they're having to do things digitally, and so some of that is really seems like it should be an easy transition, but we know when we have a vision for an in-person event, such as WILD was meant to be an in-person conference, this transition of shifting from in-person to virtual or changing your vision from what you've been working on for months, and these are volunteers that are putting these new chapters together. A lot of it had to mean that the global team had to show a lot of empathy, really have a lot of communication, help them get to a place where they really feel comfortable that the digital engagement won't detract from their overall goals to create a network which supports women's leadership. So that's just a really recent example, and regardless of which culture one comes from, one common thing was really just showing empathy at all times. And then in my own personal leadership practice, Women in Global Health has just transitioned to staff for the first time a few months ago. And what that really meant is this brand new team that is going through onboarding, actually the month of onboarding is when the pandemic, COVID was announced as a pandemic. So it was really a test to my own leadership of initially having thought that I would have a lot more face-to-face time. We would get to do team building and have the time to actually explain this is our organizational history and this is where we're trying to go. And so having to take a brand new team on during these times also means that really using adaptive leadership styles, and that means basically each person on the team has different needs and different ways of communication that are needed. And as a leader, we have to learn all the different languages of communication. And so a lot of that has been part of the practice that I've personally, really had to tap into and learn and grow. And I think these are clearly strengths we see in women's leadership. So when we look globally at countries that are doing the best in COVID times, they are often led by women. And the leadership style that they are using is collaborative leadership and being less competitive and actually really using collective approaches. Empathy is another thing that has been recognized. And we need to see that strong leadership is something that women can exercise, but they can also show a lot of empathy and collaboration. And in times of crisis, we need to really be able to operate it with many different mindsets. So that's what I'd really say is just keep up the collaborative spirit, have the open communication, show a lot of empathy, and see the fact that there is a lot of power in that, especially in times of crisis.
Right. Thanks, Rupa. I appreciate you kind of highlighting what you're seeing amongst other leaders, both inside and outside of our sector. Sylvia, would love to turn over to you to hear if you could please introduce yourself and then tell us a bit about your experience leading during this time of crisis, and what are you seeing amongst your colleagues and other leaders? Like, what are some of the kind of great behaviors that you're seeing, and how do you think that we could keep those going, those leadership qualities that are maybe not always as present as we'd like to in our everyday workforce?
Great. Well, first of all, thank you for being here. It's really a privilege to be on this panel and with all of these distinguished women. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of HDI VOCA. In my role as Chief Operating Officer, I lead both the technical and operational aspects of our organization. And right now, I'm also leading the subcommittee of our Enterprise Risk Committee on the response to COVID-19. For those of you who don't know HDI VOCA, we are a global development design and delivery partner based in Washington, and have developed economic and social development projects around the world since 1963, primarily in agriculture, economic growth, resilience, finance, and equity and inclusion. I think we're known as a leading market systems practitioner that addresses food security, economic prosperity, and social inclusion through locally driven market solutions. I just want to say Sarah's comments really resonated with me. One of the things that people hear sometimes when they think about leadership is that leadership is in fact pretty lonely. I thought maybe I was alone in having some of those reactions by staff who wanted to be more directed when we were trying to give them agency. So it was really interesting, Sarah, to not be alone in that. And Rupa, your comments about different experiences around the world also resonated with me, because I think a lot of what we hear is, well, we're all in the same boat, so everybody take a step back. But the reality is we're not all in the same boat. We're not all in the same boat within our own organizations. We have a huge array of different circumstances and individual circumstances that our staff are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And they are vast, and they require a lot of individual attention and support to help them through these difficult times. I think that one of the cores to leading in a crisis, and I think maybe also generally, is transparency and being principled in decision making. You know, going back to Sarah's comments on the importance of being decision makers and being empathetic to those recipients of our decisions. I actually will say I draw a little bit on previous experiences as I'm looking at this. And I recall joining an organization a long time ago as the only woman on the management team. And in my third month of being with the organization, I was brought into a room with a small other group of people and said, we need to cut by next month 10% of our workforce. And here's the list of the individuals. And I was a little nervous, and I was brand new. I wasn't sure what my voice was or what it should be, but I didn't understand this list. So I asked two questions. I said, well, first of all, I'm the newest one and one of the highest paid individuals in this organization. Why is my name not on this list? There's something wrong with this list. And second of all, what were the principles and criterion that were used to make this decision? I told them to understand these, because when I go in front of staff to describe our decision, I needed to be transparent, truthful, and have the data to back that up. And I think that the team had not thought about that we were actually going to have to get in front of staff and explain our decision. By the next day, we developed a list of criterion and applied it fairly and consistently to our workforce. And that list changed actually quite substantially. And then I also realized why my name wasn't on that list is because this team of men needed some help in making good decisions. So while it was difficult time and difficult decisions, we were really able to explain it to our colleagues. And I think that helped build trust in our decision making and our willingness to be transparent. And that actually really helped the organization move forward after that. You know, that kind of transparency builds trust in leadership. And that trust is an important leadership concept to me that I think we need to put into place today. I can no longer walk the halls like I really enjoy doing to see how our teams are doing and check in with them and ask how their families are. You know, that's difficult because I miss that interaction. But there's one thing for sure, I trust that they are working harder than ever before because I see the results of their work. I've actually had to remind a few of our colleagues who seem to be really struggling with our move to a more flexible scheduled environment that leadership trusts them and that the work is getting done, and they need to reduce some of the intense stress they're feeling about not being available 24/7, which isn't the expectation when they have enormous burdens on them. You know, my leadership style comes from an inherent trust in my teams, but I also don't think that trust is a legal contract. You can't just expect a quid pro quo exchange from another person, especially in a working environment. And instead of thinking of trust as something that can be negotiated, I think of it as something you look for from others in exchange for first putting it out there yourself. And I think trying to build a trusting environment in this new working environment is very important.
All right. Thanks a lot for those comments, Sylvia. You know, really appreciate you sharing those stories. So for everyone who's joined us on the webinar, all of your questions are welcome. You could just pop them into the Q&A box, and after we hear from our next panelist, our next two panelists, we're going to turn to the Q&A. So would love to hear what questions our panel can answer for you. And I've also invited our panelists to consider what follow-up questions they have for one another. So we might ask them to go first. Susie, thank you so much for being on our panel this morning. When we spoke last week, part of what struck me when we spoke about your leadership and the leadership at your company during this time was sort of how calm you were when you were talking about the volume upheavals. So please introduce yourself, and I just would love to hear about some of your company's like crisis planning process. And of course, it's one thing to have a plan and then another thing to execute it. So over to you.
Well, thank you. I was somewhat surprised by the fact you thought I was calm, which is always, you know, great, you know, but I think it's also critically important. Anyways, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. I'm Susie Mudge. Up until April 1st of this year, I was the president and CEO of Chemonics International. Similar to many others of my colleagues on this panel, it's one of the large international global development company focused on making change happen in the world around us. We've been in existence as of this year, 45 years, and it's been an incredible organization that has really strived to deliver sustainable results, similar to many of my colleagues here. I'm currently, as part of, you know, a very principled succession and leadership strategy, and now the chair of the board of Chemonics, as well as serving as an executive advisor, and it's very excited about what has happened. But at Chemonics, we do actually have, and over the years have developed what we consider a living document, which is our crisis management plan. And I have found that having this plan and adhering to this plan and not letting emotions and everything else that can happen during particularly a crisis and or a pandemic such as what we're living today, it's really, really important to have that sort of foundation, that base that you can then, you know, really systematically look at all of the different issues that you need to be addressing during a time when there is a lot of emotion and a lot of uncertainty, and staff are really looking to you, not only what decisions you're making and how you're making those decisions, but also even how you are presenting yourself during the course of this event. And so I think it's always been so important to me during the times when I've had to lead, you know, during crisis, that it is that calmness, that resilience, that transparency and empathy that many of my colleagues have already talked about. It becomes so much more important. Whether it was early on when we were still in the process of fine-tuning our crisis management plan, and I remember vividly, I don't think I will ever forget this time, where we actually had all our leadership in from the field, and we're doing a leadership development conference, and got that, as we all know, those 3:00 a.m. calls where we had a bombing in Afghanistan and had lost a beloved engineer, local engineer. And so I was appointed to head the crisis management team at that time, because obviously the president CEO was involved with the conference. And so was dealing with that and following the protocol and following the rules. And then within 18 hours of that, we lost one of our headquarters staff to a car accident. She had been out running and was hit by a car. And that was also just in an incredibly emotional time, and having to deal with both, and the death protocols and all of that. People, commented that, you had to be calm. I mean, yes, you can be emotional, but you had to be calm during that period. And I know that that is something that has continued to resonate with me during, times where we are managing crisis, and certainly even now, as Chemonics is doing its COVID crisis response. We actually, one of our executive vice presidents is leading that charge, but as always, the senior leadership, including the board, has been very much a part of that process as well. And so I think having those plans and having those protocols and knowing when to elevate and what types of communication streams you need to be adhering to are so helpful when you are faced with, this uncertainty. And again, you never can predict and plan for everything, but by having that foundation and having some of those steps to go through, it really has been helpful for us as an organization to be able to respond. And I mean, it's just amazing to me, we did a trial run on a Thursday, and that following Monday, we were 100% remote. And it just shows that as organizations, we were more prepared in some ways than we thought, and in other areas we had to bring a lot of things together. But I think having that foundation has always served us so well in the course of the work that we're doing. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so interesting. Thanks, Susie. Well, and you kind of pulled the curtain open to sort of share some of that calmness that you were projecting last week that had unfortunately a lot of experience, practicing and maintaining that. So thank you. And I think that's just a great point to underline, for all of us, like this, that it's okay to have the emotion, but important to stay calm in your leadership role. Kathleen, also in our conversation last week, what was so fascinating to me was how you framed your company's COVID response in terms of phases. And I'd like to invite you just to introduce yourself and just to share, what phase are we in now and where do you see us going? What may come next for the global development sector?
Great, thank you, Fiona, and thanks to everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and thanks for being with us today. I'm the president and CEO of APT Associates. APT is, like Chemonics and DAI and ACI VOCA, a global development partner with all of the donors across the world. We also have a big presence here in the United States in the domestic work in the United States. So our portfolio is quite complex in terms of managing both responses in many offices across the United States, as well as 80+ offices internationally. So when Fiona and I talked about this, and I think I resonate a lot with what Susie mentioned, it's you've got to lean on what you can control in a time like this, and what you can control is planning, strong principles around project management, clarity on who's in charge, when decisions will be made, who can make those decisions, and clear and frequent communications. So for us, as Fiona mentioned, I think about it in phases, and from the discussions this morning, we all sort of came out in the early days in what I'll call more the speed and urgency phase. As Susie said, from Thursday to Monday, we had to all go remote. It was less a focus on accuracy of information and more on go with your gut, good decision making, move as quickly as possible to make sure everybody was safe. We then looked at scenarios, we looked at business continuity, but in the course of just a few weeks, we were all in that very urgent mode, and putting in place a pandemic response team, a set of leaders who met 2 or 3 times a week to really monitor the situation, set up an email where people were passing in comments and questions, as others, Sarah and Sylvie have noted, was really key. We were in this sort of early urgent stage. We then moved into another stage, what I call kind of the maintain stage, where we'll talk in a little bit more about some of the silver linings that I think we're seeing in this, but we saw a lot of really goodness happening in that stage. And now I think as leaders, we're all moving into a stage that I'm calling the new normal. We're all trying to determine, we're putting speed and urgency from my perspective on the back burner, and we're moving into a slower, more deliberate, considered stage of next steps. What will the new normal look like? When do we go back into the office? When do we engage at the community level in a way to kind of put forth our programs in a way that are most productive and effective in carrying out our work? So I say we still in this phase need to lean on clarity of how and when and who makes decisions. We still need to lean on consistency of communication. So we stood up global chats that we hold every other week, and we do it by region. We do one here in the United States, we do one in Africa and the UK and in the middle of the world, and then we do an Asia one. Every other week for 30 minutes, I go on and with some of my leaders and we just touch base with folks. The great thing about, I think Rupa talked about sort of being a leader remotely, using Zoom or using WebEx, using chat boxes, using the technology where folks can send their questions in, is a really different mode for me. I love to engage with people. I have to be able to read the room. I like to see people's body language. So this has been a real shift for me, to be in front of a camera and not be able to see the hundreds of people on the other side. But we've figured out a way to engage, to get feedback, to understand and keep our finger on the pulse of what their anxieties are and what their concerns are. So as we get back to that new normal, I want to just stress that I think all of us as leaders need to pump the brakes a bit. We need to be slower. We need to be more deliberate and considered in how we re-engage. So at APT, we've set out some pillars for reopening. We've said the number one priority is obviously, and Sarah mentioned this, employee health and safety. We've been blown away at how successful people have been working remotely, right? So we weren't sure what we were gonna get when we sent everybody home. But I think, relatively consistently across the globe, people are doing their jobs, doing well. We're out reaching out to support them. They're able to work fairly productively and do their work. So there's no need to rush back immediately. The second would be client needs and mission impact, right? We want to do our work well. We want to make sure that we're executing well, but we want to make sure, again, that employees are safe. So we're asking our project leaders in each country, this will be a phased approach to the new normal. We're asking everybody in the United States and across the country, across the world, as your country lifts a stay-at-home order, present a plan. We're giving them templates. Present a plan that tells us how you are going to re-engage. Who's essential to be in the office? How will you make sure that from a facility standpoint that you de-densify, that you think about the air quality? When we think about how people will transport themselves to work, how will they be safe in doing so? In Papua New Guinea, for example, we, for safety reasons and security reasons, we transport people on buses. So our staff now are really thinking about how do we de-densify and create the cleanliness on buses and other transportation mechanisms to make sure people are going to work safely. We're looking at the underlying health conditions of employees, people who we think just should not return to the office. We need to be flexible and considered about that, as well as folks who just plain don't feel comfortable in that setting. This has been an incredible experience for many. Many have had the impact of COVID-19 on their own families. They've had increased caregiving responsibilities. Schools have been locked down. A number of my colleagues have mentioned all this. So we need to be, as supervisors and leaders, flexible for an extended period of time as we go back and think about how to re-enter. So that's what I'd call my third phase, as Fiona pointed out. In order for me to sort of stay as calm as Susie and provide the empathy and support to my colleagues and leaders, I have to be structured. That's kind of my thing. I need to kind of put a project structure around it. And as you know, all of us are working in incredibly complex situations that are experiencing COVID at very different levels. Here in the United States, for example, the first question I got when Georgia opened was, Kathleen, are you going to open the Atlanta office? And I said, absolutely not. So, you know, we have to make sure that when we open, we're considering and balancing both the client needs and our desire to have a mission impact with really what's good for our staff. So I think we're all moving into phase 3, the new normal. How do we define it and over what period of time? I think it's going to be a long haul. We've made an announcement yesterday that we don't foresee any kind of new normal, even at a phased approach at Apt Associates, much before September 1st.
Okay, thanks for that glimpse into the future, Kathleen, and also hearing you share that structure and the real practicalities of that structure. I think that's very helpful and useful as we all consider, you know, what is the next phase and how does that look and how do we think about making those decisions. So ladies, your remarks have prompted an outpouring of questions. What I'd like to do is to share 3 or 4 of those. If you want to each consider, you know, what you'd like to respond to, we'll try and get through as many as others. Thank you to our question posers, and feel free to keep sending those in. So the first question is, what do the speakers use as personal centering practices in times of crisis? And we have a couple of other questions along those lines of, like, how do you keep yourself centered? How do you ensure your own self-care as you're caring for so many other people? Our second question is, what advice do you have for people to express leadership, to show their leadership, even though they don't formally have those leadership roles? And then great question here about what have been some decisions that you've made as leaders and managers that didn't work out well, and what have you learned from that others can learn from as well? That's from Julia Garside. And then Simi, a couple of specific questions for you. One is, how are you working to collaborate with other NGOs and government or private funders to stabilize funding during this crisis? And Rupa, maybe that's another, it's also one that you want to answer. And then Simi, also interested how in your work with youth junior achievement in Nigeria, what kind of support are you finding that those youth need, and what kind of leadership qualities are you role modeling in particular to the young people who are facing a lot of upheaval? So a variety of, oh, and let me just throw this other one in from Scott. From Satya Bartlett. She asks, when forced to change the vision for specific project activities, which have been worked on for months, there can be resistance and a desire to postpone or return to business as usual. How can leaders support the change management of this process? Okay, so a real variety there for you all to choose from. Simi, maybe we can start with you. Maybe we'll go from Simi to Rupa, just kind of hearing you comment on that question about funders and donors. And then why don't be happy to call on Sylvia, Susie, Sarah, and then Kathleen for whichever questions you'd like to address. So over to you, Simi. Oh, and Simi, you're muted, just so you know.
Thank you. Yes, so funding, as I mentioned earlier, has become a challenge. Historically, junior achievement is heavily dependent on corporate because we focus on work readiness skills and preparing young people for the workforce. So we tend to get most of our funding from the corporations who help us prepare them for the workforce. But because of the pandemic and because of the issues that corporations are facing with their CSR budgets, we've had to expand to donor agencies and government aid agencies like the USAID and some of the organizations represented on the panel. And so what that has done in terms of my leadership skills is pivot. How do we sell the junior achievement story to organizations who don't see us as humanitarian? You know, we're not feeding the hungry, and we're not healing the sick. And so how do we communicate the urgency of what we do? For example, the second question about the youth in Nigeria is very key to answering this question. We have a very high rate of unemployment in Nigeria. We have a very young population. Over 50% of our population is under 30. And we have 1.8 million graduating secondary school, but only able to absorb 700,000 in the university. So you have more than 1 million people entering the unemployment market every year. And this leads to a lot of unrest, restive youth who are hungry, who have no skills to join the workforce, who are not able to get jobs. And so what we've done is sort of develop ways that we can engage them quickly in entrepreneurship skills, and how to now make that something that we can, sell to donor agencies as a way to avert disaster, because we have this bulging youth population and they are restive, they are hungry. How do we communicate the urgency of quickly putting them to work and quickly giving them skills that they're able to feed their families is one of the things that we're having to really develop as an organization. And one thing that helps me is being part of Junior Achievement, which is a worldwide network. There are two groups that are helping me currently in thinking about solutions. One is a JA Africa family of executive directors, but another one, which we had a long call yesterday, is a group of high growth countries like Nigeria, where the executive directors have been put together in this high achieving group. It happens to be all women, which is fantastic. And we're able to come together and think about solutions. What are we doing in our countries to ensure that we're reaching the numbers very quickly, and we're developing solutions. So having that network support helps with the loneliness that Sylvia alluded to about having to come up with solutions pretty quickly. And then the third thing is that we've had to, personally, I've had to think about solutions outside the Junior Achievement Network in developing Project ARC, which is an organization that also is learning about feeding the hungry. So if we bring them in with food and then we layer that on top with skills, it also helps to quickly get their attention and help to prefer solutions. And so I'm happy to be learning from Kathleen and Susie. I was taking notes as they were speaking about their crisis management plan. I'm going to be reaching out to you after this call, because it's something that we are facing in Nigeria. We know that another month of lockdown will probably result in violence if we don't act quickly, because there are a lot of people who earn daily wages who are not able to go out and earn their daily wage, and they're hungry, and they're young, able-bodied men who, if they're not fed, will probably resort to, demanding that what they need. And so we really need that crisis management plan immediately.
Great. Thanks a lot, Simi. Really, appreciate you painting that picture for us and hearing how you're being flexible and then making the case for donors for why this new kind of response is valuable and needs to be funded. Rupa, you're welcome to speak to any of those questions. I know you've got a lot of richness to share, so I think whatever you would most like to respond to.
Great. And, following after Simi, I think some of the things that I'd like to really emphasize is that, especially for those of us that are all of us actually working in development and global health, for us, our mission has not changed in this current crisis. And I think that's really been critical to how we engage with our donors and our partners, saying that our mission is actually much more relevant now. So Women in Global Health is very much around making sure that we have gender equality in global health leadership. But part of that is really ensuring that we acknowledge that women are leaders. And this crisis has shown us that while women make up a majority of the health workforce, they're not necessarily getting the most visibility or on decision-making tables. So our mission is much more relevant, I would say even now than other times, in the sense that people are paying attention as they think about building back health systems, responding to the current pandemic. We also know that issues of particularly the work conditions, so majority of the health workforce does not have safe and decent work conditions. These are women, and 50% of what women do in the health sector and social sector is unpaid. And these are issues that Women in Global Health has already been advocating for and working on. So I'd say that, what I would advise leaders leaders of organizations, and there was questions about how do you get your team behind a shift in a project, or how do you keep them focused. What we really did is our strategy has outlined very much that these are our goals, and COVID-19 became just a context that we needed to test our strategy even more against. And for us, it has aligned really well. And I would say, you know, a lot of communication, taking time in this time of urgency. We all feel like we don't have time to have long calls, but I've been reminded by my team how much they also appreciate post-call when we've had, let's say, a longer debrief and a deeper dive. And so I think just thinking about not only communicating externally, but also internally with your team. And I wanted to also touch on the wellness one. This is something that once myself and my team just realized, you know, that COVID was going to create a much more long-term, I heard others talk about the new norm. We've really also tried to encourage each other. What are we doing to have wellness in our life? I mean, personally, I set the day with a, you know, short 10-minute meditation. I have blocked out time every day between 6 to 7 that no matter what I'm doing, some sort of physical activity, exercise. The team knows it. On weekends, I do have half a day blocked out. And what I'm trying to do with the team is say, continue to start taking your weekends. I don't want to see emails and messages late at night. And if I do see them doing that, I send a reminder, because this is really a marathon. And the more we support each other's behavioral change and realize that, you know, this is a long game, that we need everybody in it to be able to have their health and wellness. And so final note is also to make it fun too. There's some great social media challenges out there. The World Health Organization has a challenge called Stay Healthy, Stay at Home. And so that's one that many of our chapter members have participated and sent videos into. A lot of celebrities are participating in that. So I think about how to keep it fun as well, because as humans, we still need to be able to, you know, have those, what I call little pleasures as part of our day-to-day life.
Right. Thanks, Rupa. Appreciate, you know, hearing how you're taking care of yourself and how you're encouraging others to as well. It's a great practical advice for us. Sylvia, tell us which question you'd like to speak to, and then we'd just love to hear your comments on it.
Sure. I'll just follow on Rupa. I think that taking care of yourself is really important, particularly because I found several times as a leader, I was surprised that people notice things. People are watching. People are looking to us as leaders, and I think we need to model the behavior that we hope our future leaders will have. I know that I usually have a very heavy travel schedule, and when I'm in DC, I often don't get home from work until 7:30. I've had dinner more often with my family in the last 2 months than I've probably had in a year and a half. I've really enjoyed those dinners, and they've tended to be longer than ever before and get into some really great conversations with my teenage daughter. I also think that it's really important to not be, and I'm repeating Rupa, but I think it's a really important point, about making sure that you aren't working at all hours. You know, if I send an email at 10 o'clock at night, people tend to sometimes respond, and that is not my intention. There was perhaps one example in the last year when we have large projects in Ethiopia, and I had to deal with the crisis of an Ethiopian airplane crash and worrying about the safety and security of our staff, and calling somebody very early in the morning to say we need to put our plan in place and we need to identify everybody at risk. But otherwise, I don't want people working all hours of the night. So even though that hasn't been the go-to in my career, I'm working really hard at that. And I think the other part, which is important to all of us for many different reasons, is taking leave. We need our staff to take the leave, and we need to figure out what leave looks like in a COVID lockdown. One of my colleagues posted something on kind of our internal fun site about a vacation day at the beach, where she and her family, you know, dressed up for the beach and kind of had fun with their young kids and other things like Rupa was talking about, fun challenges. But we have to figure out what leave looks like, because we can't end up the second half of the year with everybody needing to take leave. We need to help them now. So I'll stop there because I know we're running short on time.
Yeah, great point, Sylvia. Thanks so much. Susie, what question are you speaking to?
No, I think they're all great questions. I think the one that I'd love to just sort of talk about is how others can, use this opportunity as a way for them to also experience and express their own leadership style. Because I think, as many of us have articulated, that environment of trust is so important. But it's also, I think, a responsibility that each and every one of us has as we're participating, whether it's proposals, projects, creative problem solving on what this new reality it means for the projects and the people that we work with. So many times I am floored by the ideas that are coming up from our staff, and from all levels. And I think it's ensuring that we're continuously asking and empowering, but finding new ways to really have people present ideas, because you're not just, as one of us talked, walking down the hall and being able to ask people. It's creating those new forms or new ways, or even one-on-ones, the coffee chats that I know our staff are having with each other, or the Zoom happy hours, but then maybe not just happy hours, but Zoom, creative thinking, brainstorming sessions. I mean, it's the new normal now, but I just find that every one of us is responding differently to this challenge. And many of us, and I know many of my colleagues, are now homeschooling, are having to take on new responsibilities, and do not have the support that they may have during when things were back to normal. And you need to take that into consideration also as you are asking staff to do things or respond in ways. And so I just think it's every one of us has something to contribute, and every one of us has a way of demonstrating that leadership, and whether it's us as role models or us just creating the space so that we can learn, because we're continuously learning as well. It's just so important in these times to be available, reach out, ask the hard questions, but also create a place so that people can really communicate what they're feeling, what they're thinking, what they're doing, and celebrating it as well, because I think that feedback loop is even that much more important during a period like now. So just my 2 cents.
Yeah, absolutely, Susie. Thank you so much for sharing that. Sarah, what's resonating with you with these questions?
Well, I'd like to speak to the question on leadership, and turn that into what advice do we on the panel have for people at varying stages in their careers to develop their leadership skills. And I think that a crisis presents a great opportunity for people at all points in their career to step in and step up. So my advice would be, don't wait to be asked. And if there's, a part of, if there's something going on that you think you can contribute to, or that you're interested in learning about, jump in and offer up your support. It's a great way to build connections with senior leaders, to build connections with staff at all levels of the company. So I think that the big advice is don't be shy. And I will say that I have been super, super impressed with the talent that is out there in the nooks and crannies in departments and functions that I wouldn't ordinarily be looking to for advice. I wouldn't ordinarily be looking to for conceptualizing a strategy or writing a document. And that talent exists throughout the organization. So to everybody out there, don't be shy. Don't think if you're in a certain function or you're at a junior level that you don't have something to add, or that your contributions won't be appreciated.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sarah. And Kathy,
Sarah, I have a question.
Yeah.
How do you go about finding those people also? How do you go about attracting and getting them to how do you identify them, or how do they self-identify?
So right now I'm leading a work stream on workforce. So I knew that I needed to bring in people from security, people from facilities, people from HR, people from IT. I mean, literally across the entire company. And, some of them I knew from, my decades of interactions and managing cross-functional teams, and others I didn't. And really for me, it's somebody steps in and says, I'm on the security team, but I know a lot about travel and I have some ideas. I'll say, great, lay it out for me and, and give me a deadline and let me see what you've got. And, and invariably it's usually really good. Or, it can take some tweaking and some redirecting. And so it's really just, making sure that people understand that I will be open to wherever they're coming from in the organization at whatever level. And a junior person can play a really critical role on an important task force. So thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Love your message about don't wait to be asked. And just to flesh that out, I remember, Rupa, you were speaking to this in our conversation last week, saying it's also helpful when people can be very specific about what it is that they're bringing to you. So don't wait to be asked, and also kind of be explicit about the value that you want to bring. Kathleen, would love to hear of those questions, what really sort of jumped out for you for, what you want to talk to based on your recent experience.
Yeah, so there was one of the questions that said, we've seen a lot of changes and new behaviors. How do we get them to stick? Is sort of my shorthand of that question. And I'd kind of put that in my category of silver linings. I mean, one of the things about this new normal, if you will, has been the amazing amount of creativity and innovation that's been going on across our teams. People who had to run large community gatherings or carry out tasks in ways that were, firmly in person, and had to adjust to new ways of doing things, infusing digital within projects and more quickly than maybe they could have anticipated, having a list of things that they wished that they were going to do in the future, but they suddenly had to do because the time was now. So I'd say, I think we should all focus on what should we be stopping at APT. For me, it was paper. Any processes that are paper dependent, we need to stop and get digital in there. What should we start doing? And so I'm really super excited about our teams who have come out and they run weekly ideation sessions, as Susie was mentioning, kind of getting on to WebEx and Zoom and collaborating a whole lot more, making learning a more natural act where, it might have been a nice thing to do in the past. It's so critical right now for us to share those experiences or those new ways of doing things, because this is going to be a marathon, as Rupa points out. This is not going to be something that we switch off in the next month or two. And then what processes should we be refining? What should we look at that's really inefficient, that, we've just been doing it for a really long time, and get rid of it. So I think that I just actually Googled while I was waiting, and it says that it takes on average 66 days for a new behavior to form. So I just want to give encouragement to the person who asked that question. I think we have an opportunity to become more agile, more innovative, more effective and supportive supervisors, because we don't have the luxury of walking the halls, as Sylvia said. We don't have the luxury of being in person with folks. We've got to figure out how to be as effective and as supportive at a distance. And so I think we're going to see a lot of silver linings out of this, and I hope we can all just stay the course on it, and make sure that we're reinforcing that going back to more behaviors of inertia or flat-footedness aren't in our best interests, and hopefully we'll all adopt those behaviors because we'll have plenty of time to do it.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks so much, Kathleen. And I'd love to just, for our final question for all the panelists to speak to, I'd love to springboard off of Kathleen's mention of silver linings, and also introduce, the idea of gratitude, if each of you could share something that you find as a silver lining or something that you find yourself, having a lot of gratitude for during this time, I think that would be, just really nice for our community. So I think we'll just go, Kathleen, if you want to just head off, and then we'll just go
Sure.
Kathleen, Sarah.
I would say that that for me, and I think probably all of us as leaders are in this category. I was just been so lucky to have an amazing team that has come together in this sort of preparedness crisis mode. That stayed aligned, that stayed consistent, that drove our processes. I can talk a lot about what APT is doing, but quite frankly, I'm not the one driving all this. So I just want to give my hats off to and great thanks to my leadership team, who's doing an exceptional job of managing in these very uncertain and unprecedented times.
Great, fantastic. Here's to them. Simi, what are you grateful for? Or Simi, and then Sarah, what are you grateful for? Or what's a silver lining for you in this time?
So I'll talk about a personal one and then a professional one. The personal one is that my sons, who are now teenagers, are going to high school in the US in September. And the time that this has afforded us to really bond as a family has been fantastic. It's just also to share our values with them as a family going into boarding school in a different country. And so I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for their, especially with their father, role modeling for them in this setting. Professionally, I think what I'm grateful for is the humanizing of relationships. Also, it's removed the what is Junior Achievement's role in this to what is my role as Simi Wogugu in development in Nigeria. And I've actually had conversations with government leaders on a personal level, and how can I be useful to you in terms of just supporting digital education. I mentioned during our call last week that we're seeing a lot of innovation where the commissioners of education are women. And the fact that I've been able to develop friendships with these women have been very rewarding for me and for them, because I'm able to also have a conversation with them about, going digital and what that means in a country where technology is still a big challenge. So for me, the silver linings have been the relationship personally and professionally, and I'm grateful for that.
All right, fantastic. Thanks so much. Sarah.
I think I would echo a little bit of each Kathleen and Simi's comments. I've been really grateful to all of the staff who have adapted through really, difficult and strange times and stressful times. And then to all of the staff who've really stepped up and jumped in to support, the multiple efforts that we're undertaking right now to address, both the crisis and the recovery planning. And then I would also add in that I'm grateful to have a bit more time with my family, not a massive amount of time. We all get up and go to our separate rooms and don't really come back together until dinner, but somehow it's just nice to be in the same house and know that, if my daughter has a question, she can come and interrupt me. So it has been nice to get that, a little bit of extra time. Really nice.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm sure you speak for many of us there. Susie, what are you grateful for? What's been a silver lining for you in this time?
Sorry, unmuting is always a challenge, right?
Always.
No, I think it's echoing what everybody else has said. I think it's just finding a new way of working and knowing that we can, in fact, doing that. But I also think that realizing a lot of things that we have been doing are no longer necessary, like what Kathleen was saying. We've been certainly looking at some of our processes to see if, in fact, they really need to continue in the way that they are. So I think it is really giving yourself the opportunity to reflect also, is this critical? Is this important? Or, maybe it's not. Maybe the way we've always done it is not necessarily the way we're going to be doing it going forward. I mean, I was so amazed how efficient we could be in meetings. Meetings that used to take 2 hours, we are now able to accomplish things in a much more efficient and effective way. I mean, it was just like, hey guys, we can really
Oh my
do
gosh,
this. Or
that is so true.
5 minutes, in between meetings so that you could run and, take a break and figure out things. But things that I think will long be used, that I will continue to use going forward. But I also think it is also making sure that you're creating space so that all voices can be heard. And so people respond differently, as I was saying earlier, and just trying new ways to really ensure that everyone's voice is being heard, because I just think it's so important at this time that, realizing everybody's different, and how can I, celebrate that difference and that diversity, but also ensure that I'm creating a space where those voices can continue to be heard.
Thanks so much for underlining that, Susie. Rupa, what's the silver lining for you in this time? What are you taking forward?
Yes, I'm going to build on what a lot of what's already been said, but on the personal side, I think it's been really great to just, again, feel even more connected to the community. And I really do think that we've been able to, for those that do have access to the digital world, have been really able to see much more diversity on panels, much more diverse conversations. So I think that's been really great to see many more women being able to participate from all around the world, and especially Global South. But the second part is very much going back to, for women in global health, we've been advocating for gender equality in global health leadership, and really making sure that the health agenda continues to be more gender responsive, and seeing that now this is on the minds of everybody and the minds of head of government. So it really is an opportunity to build back better, have gender responsive health systems. And so we really see a very progressive agenda opportunity. And so I'm going to say that I hope all of you will join in the efforts to building back better, and that we really make sure women leaders and gender responsive health systems are created as a result.
Yeah, right on, Rupa. Thank you. Count us in. We're going to give the final word to Sylvia in just a moment. And for all of you who are joining us in the audience, please enter into the Q&A 1 or 2 takeaways that you're taking away from this panel. We'd love to know. I think our panelists have done a great job of being both inspirational and also very concrete in their advice. And we would love your feedback. I know they would appreciate your feedback on what you're taking away from this panel that you'll be able to apply, or is giving you more food for thought. Sylvia, would love for you to kind of close us out with what you're grateful for, what you're seeing as a silver lining.
I guess 2 things. I'm really grateful for how our teams have really jumped in to look at this from across the world, sharing their experiences, talking about how they're pivoting their projects, and how they're successfully taking this difficult situation and still living our mission and doing our impact, even if it meant that they had to pivot quickly to new strategies. In the home office, we've created a really dynamic tool to communicate those lessons learned and to really begin looking at it. I'm grateful that our gender team, for example, recently published their recommendations for agriculture and market systems projects implementation with a gender lens, where they're really looking at how this crisis is negatively impacting marginalized groups in ways that are critical. And we really have to make sure we're focusing on women, the youth, the elderly, indigenous populations, and on and on. And we've got to get that lens on what we're doing and keep it focused. But I guess I'll just end with, we talked about the importance of empathy as leaders. I have been grateful for the empathy that the teams across ACI VOCA have shown to leadership. We did an internal survey a week and a half ago and asked some tough questions, and we're prepared for the feedback, and we wanted honest feedback. And we got some great feedback and great suggestions, and we're putting that into action. But we also got an unexpected and unprecedented amount of empathy for what we're trying to do. And we're not doing it every day at 100%, but it doesn't mean we aren't trying. And I appreciate the empathy my staff and my teams have shown us.
Great. Thank you, Sylvia. I think that's such an important point that you're closing with about the importance of doing our best job as leaders, and also appreciating the support that leaders are also receiving from others as people lead at every level. So we have a few more questions that we didn't get to, and panelists, with your permission, we could post those on LinkedIn. We could do a post and just sort of tag you, and if you have a couple of minutes to dive in and answer some further questions, I think this community would really appreciate it. We could also maybe reach an even larger audience.
Great.
So, okay, awesome. Thank you for that. So thank you for everyone who's joined us. Seeing that we had people on this in our audience for this panel who were participating from across the greater Washington, D.C. area. We had people from West Africa, East Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, Europe, and we're really grateful for your audience attention. Thank you for your excellent questions. And if we can just give a virtual round of applause for all of our panelists for showing us great leadership in this last hour or so. So thank you so much.
Right.
Hey.
Thank you, Fiona.
Thanks to you.
Thank you, Fiona.
Thank you, Fiona.
Thanks, everyone. Really great connecting.
Yeah, feel the same way. Thanks to all of you.
Become a member of the WILD community by registering for the Women in Global Development Leadership Forum happening virtually on October 26. Please visit our website www.wildleadershipforum.org to register today. And a special thank you to our sponsors.